we are going to do a couple polls here because we figured out it was actually a bug with GoToWebinar if you guys weren't here before. But I'm going to launch just a couple here to start, just to kind of see where we're at with everyone who's attending the webinar today. But the first one I'm going to launch here is, what version of Mastercam are you guys using? And I have been sending the emails out to see if people are using the beta, maybe you're using older versions of Mastercam, or maybe you're someone who doesn't have Mastercam yet and wants to check out this webinar to see what we can offer. But I'll leave this open just for a couple seconds. I'll check real quick here to see if we have any questions. I don't see any. So we're good there. Okay, it looks like everyone pretty much voted. It looks like a vast majority are using X9, so that's good. We are on update 3 of X9, so if you need like the SolidWorks 2017 translator, 2016, sorry, that was included in the most recent update to X9. So I'll close that poll off. The other one I'm going to launch here is if you've tried the 2017 beta. So the last couple email blasts I've sent out, we had some information on how you can get access to the beta. Really just the only thing that's required is a current maintenance contract, and then you can go ahead and link your account, and we'd be happy to help you link your account if you're having issues with that, but you can do it right inside the X9 interface now. I just want to see if anyone's actually trying it out or had a chance to take a look at it yet. If you're unfamiliar with how the beta process works, it's now public. So if I were to go to mastercam.com here, the only thing I have to do is make sure that I am logged in to my account. So if I log in here, it'll then give me access to all the different downloads and things like that. So the second kind of slide here is the public beta. So if I click on the public beta page, it'll give you some information about it, a video where you can watch some updates and where some of the corporate people are talking about the interface. But if you scroll to the bottom and click on, and I'm guessing you guys might not be able to see my screen because I had the poll up there. But once you're on mastercam.com and logged in, you can click download public beta now, and then it'll take you to the page where you can download it. And both the regular Mastercam beta 4 now is what we're on, and the Mastercam for SolidWorks beta is also available. We're all going for some corporate training, which is actually being held here in Chicago on the new release the second week of May. So we'll have some reduced staff during that time. But that's telling me that we're probably shooting for a June release on the software. But once we have some more concrete data on that, I will be sending everyone an email blast. So a little agenda of what we're going to cover today. We're going to go over some lathe tips and tricks. Ryan's going to go over the lathe tool library, and then we're going to open it up for questions. So this is just a little more detailed list of what we're going to be covering, and it's probably about time that I pass this over to Ryan. One second here.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ryan Ramel. I'm one of the apps guys here at ShopWare. So we'll go ahead and we'll get started. Again, if you have any questions in the middle of this, you can just go ahead and ask them in the questions. Otherwise, we can ask them at the very end. So to start off here, what we're going to be doing is, this is the part we're going to be covering. We're basically going to be doing some standard OD turning on here, along with kind of showcasing some of our dynamic tool paths, but also some of our plunge tool paths as well, using some specific cutters. So to get started on this, there's going to be a couple things I can do. The first thing I'm going to do is create what we call a term profile. So if you're familiar kind of with Lathe, you can either program right off the solid model, or you can get into program right off the wireframe. So if I go up to this Create tab, I can just go ahead and say Term Profile. You see I did create a new level right away. That way my geometry gets stashed right there. Once I select that model, I'm going to be internally spinning this part around, and what that's going to do is it's going to grab the max extent of the outside diameter of here. So if I had any flats or milling geometry, it's basically going to be taking it to what would make it round. So once I do so, it's going to give me everything that I need. I can turn off my solid if I'd like, and of course it's going to just display the wireframe. So in my case, I'm just going to set up some stock here, hit the little plus sign next to properties, stock setup. I'm going to do this on my left spindle, so I can say properties again. Now in our case, I'm just going to use some standard bar stock, so we'll say like a cylinder, and I usually go make from 2 points. We'll say first point on my origin, second point on the max, on the back length, and also the OD. Now that's going to be the exact numbers, but maybe my stock size I have in stock is going to be 2.5, and let's say I'm going to be using a bar and basically pulling this off and transferring it to a sub spindle if I have that applicable to the machine. So I'm just going to say, okay, my stock is 10 inches long. Now with this, I'm going to be using some margins, that way I can do a little face cut up on front, get a nice finish there. And then lastly, I'm going to be defining some of my chuck jaws. That way I can basically collision check against those. Once I come in here, I'm just going to go ahead and say select and pick on the point of where I want to chuck on. So diameter of 2.5, that's the value I put in. And let's say let's chuck on -4 inches back. If I say preview, it's going to show me. So I'm going to chuck there. That way I got enough room to come in with a cutoff tool and cut that part off. Now that's going to be for my left spindle, and kind of like I said before, we're going to be doing a transfer over to my right side, so it is required to set up your right side spindle. The stock remaining is going to get transferred over, so I don't need to worry about setting up my stock there. For this one, you can see again we can select how we wanted to clamp on this, on the OD, ID, things like that. I'm just going to go ahead and say select for right now and pick on, we'll say that point, and of course let's say it's going to be roughly about 10 inches spacing in between my main and my sub spindle. So I'm just going to put in 10 for a visual purpose there. Once I say OK, you can see that all 3 of these are now defined. I can say OK once more. And of course there's my jaw set up. So to get in this, I'm going to go ahead and say toolpaths, go down to my face operation, NC file name, I can go ahead and say OK. Now I did create a custom tool library here to have in my proper tools, and I can show you kind of how we can do that a little bit later. I'm just going to use my standard 80 degree, of course feed speeds, coolant, all that good stuff I can fine tune in. I'm going to say go down to my Z of 0 and basically take that face cut. Now once I have that, I'm going to go ahead and say toolpath rough. I'm going to rough from here to here, and that's going to be my roughing path. Again, I'm going to use maybe that same tool. I'm going to come in here and say use stock for my outer boundary. I'm also going to extend that contour a little bit to make a little bit of room for that cutoff tool, so it's not engaging in too much stock.
So one thing people might not know about Ryan, why did you say select use stock for outer boundary?
So the use stock for outer boundary is basically going to be basing the tool path off of the stock, and it really comes in nice if you have like a casting where you don't want to do all the air cutting and things like that. But it's also going to be nice so it basically collision checks against your part, making sure that my tool is not going to over-engage in different areas. So there's a couple different options there that we can pick. Now the other thing too on this one, you can see we're not diving in here, and the reason why we're not diving in there is because we have some plunge parameters, and under plunge parameters I'm telling it don't dive in on either my X or my Z directions. So once I have this, I'm going to go ahead and rough out this center section here, and I'm actually going to do that with one of the newer style toolpaths that maybe not a lot of people are familiar with, and that one's going to be called my dynamic rough. So the dynamic rough, you're actually going to be using a button nose type of cutter, and with that I'm going to go from this chain to that chain, and that's going to be my entire profile. Once I get that, I can go ahead and say OK, and of course I'm going to go ahead and use my button nose here. Again, feeds and speeds, that would be recommended by your tooling manufacturer, and of course we can put in our step over, maybe some toolpath radius. If you're familiar with more or less the milling dynamic motion toolpath, it's going to be the same thing but more or less in lathe. Once I say OK, it's going to go ahead and generate for me, so if I give it a second, you can see my toolpath. And just to kind of show you a little bit more in depth of what it's doing, is it's coming in here, we're basically going back and forth, a zigzag, and that's exactly why we need a button nose type of cutter. So it's going to look something like that. Now with it, you can see I do have some extra stock in here, so I'm just going to go ahead and clean that up with a standard groove toolpath. And my groove toolpath, I'm just going to go here to there. I'll do that one with my groover. Again, use stock for outer boundary, that way it bases its toolpath off of my remaining stock. my roughing, I'm just going to set up some parameters here, and also how much stock do I want to leave. I'm just going to leave a little stock on this finish pass just so I can come back in and finish the whole part with a particular tool. Fine-tune a couple more parameters and you can see kind of what it's doing. So this center section is all good to go. Now my screen's getting a little cluttered up here, so I'm going to go ahead and turn off the selected tool paths. That way I don't have to display those. The other thing I'm going to do is this backside here, and this is going to be using another toolpath that, again, maybe a lot of people aren't more or less familiar with. And this one's going to be implemented here as the Plunge turn. Now the Plunge turn toolpath does require some special tools as well. We have had some customers, have personal experience where, parts not coming out exactly right, and that's because they're using the toolpath correctly, or they're just not using the correct tools. So we can definitely recommend kind of some different tools and stuff for this particular application. Basically chain it just as I would for a groove. Again, I can go ahead and pick my tool. With this one, I can kind of fine-tune some settings here. Again, pretty much more or less the same settings as we would have in a standard groove, just some specifics, more or less to this tool path. Again, for the finish too, what's nice is we do have some tool deflection for the path, and then of course how much stock do I want to leave. I'll come back in with a finish pass and do the whole thing.
So
the
tool
path is doing, eventually had a customer in our area here that
they were
using one of these new Plunge
style
tools.
originally developed with car about 4 or 5 years ago, but basically all the lathe manufacturers have come with similar tools. And the way they work is that they're basically designed to deflect a little bit. And this customer was freaking out, they were getting, I think it was 4 thou off on every part. And it turned out the difference they had to make was they had to use Plunge tool that was a regular groove. So if you are getting into any of these sort of new style plunging tools, I definitely recommend checking out this particular tool path.
So if I go ahead and say OK here, it's going to go ahead and create it, and I'm going to go ahead and just walk it through my back plot. So you can see what it's actually doing is actually going a little bit deeper, then coming up, going back down, and stepping through the motions there. So once that is good to go, the last thing I want to do is do a finish on this one. So I can go ahead and say toolpath finish. I'm just going to go ahead and do my whole entire part from point to point. And I'm just going to go ahead and use a grooving tool. That way I can do all directions on here. I'm going to tilt a little bit on my lead in, lead out. I'm going to extend it by, we'll say a little bit more to make sure it's good. And of course I'm going to plunge down in that direction. So again, that last tool path would look something like this. So once that's good to go now, I could just cut it off. Otherwise, what I could do is if I had some back work here, or maybe I want to take a face cut, I'm going to go ahead and transfer it to a spindle if my machine has that. Now, this is going to be using what we call POCO for short. It's basically going to be a pickoff, pull, and cutoff. So with that, what that's going to be doing is it does require some specific post work to be done to create some logic and make everything fine-tuned correctly. So that's going to be stashed in under my tool pass, miscellaneous op, pick off, pull, cut off. Now if I go in here, it's going to give me different options of what I can pick. In our case, I want to do a pick off, a bar pull, and then the cut off. With this, I can also do my geometry, and I can transfer it so I can actually physically work off of it. Now I'm going to turn on my other level. That way I can transfer both my solid and also my wireframe to the sub-spindle. With this one, I'm going to translate my geometry, and I can offset it by a level. That way it actually shows up as a different level in there. Now with this, I can grab my finish length of my part. Basically, where do I want to pick off my part at? So I want to pick it off, let's say, right at that shoulder. My cutoff width, I can basically pull that number. That's going to be the width of the tool from my tool library. I can also pull in my cutoff location and how much stock to leave. Now there's some operations in here. I can basically put in different information of like my approach distance and all that good stuff. So once I go ahead and say okay, it's going to come in here. You kind of see it doing the motions. And what I can do is I can turn off my main part, and then you can see it is in the sub spindle. So with that, what I usually will do is I'm going to create a second group up here. And the second group is just basically keep it nice and simple. And really all I need to do is I have that 30 thou face or back face stock. So I'm just going to go ahead and say toolpath face with this tool. Make sure to change your axis combination to my right upper. And then of course with that, where's my finish Z? Well, my finish Z is right there. And of course there it is. So just like that, we basically took that part from the main spindle. The axis is going to come over, clamp down on it. They're going to sync up, basically cut off that part, and then of course we're coming back back home with our sub spindle, and then of course we're doing a little bit more work on there.
So yeah, so this Pickoff pull cutoff, every machine that we run into seems to like these a little differently, and depending on how it's set up, how the user likes to use it. So I would get in touch with both Kim and Norbert at our office. You could just send an email to sales if you wanted. But if you do have a main and sub spindle machine and you're doing this manually right now, we basically work directly with you to customize the post, and it varies from machine to machine, but it's not overly expensive to really dial this in for you, and then you can use this operation really on any sort of part that you would run into, and the workflow is essentially the same regardless of machine type. But Ryan is going to now get into one of the other new tool paths that came out in Lathe recently.
So the last toolpath I'm going to be covering here is called our contour rough. And again, our contour rough is going to be nice because if you do have a casting, as shown here on the screen, it's going to base the toolpath off of the shape of the actual part, and again, it's not going to cut, any extra stock, where we don't have it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come into my stock setup, and if you ever do have a casting profile already drawn up, either import a solid or whatever the case may be, under my stock here, if I go to properties, I can drop it down from cylinder of using standard bar stock to revolve. Once I go to revolve, I'm going to go ahead and say select my geometry. Well, my geometry is basically going to be this outside profile. Once I have that, I can go ahead and say OK. And you can see by saying a preview, it's going to give me that actual profile for me. I'm going to go ahead and say OK. And with this, I can also set up some chuck jaws. So again, with this one, I'm going to go ahead and say select. Maybe just to get a point, I'll say select there. And let's actually modify that. Let's say we're holding on by -3 and 750. So we're looking something like this. So again, once I put everything in there that I need to, I'm just going to go ahead and say toolpath. I'm going to go down to my contour rough. Under the contour rough, NC file name is fine. My profile I want to cut is from there to there, and it's going to be automatically in the partial chain mode. Here's my tool. Again, I can dial in feeds and speeds as needed. And then, of course, there's some different parameters. How much stock do I want to leave, my minimum, and also how much do I want to offset per pass. So with this one as well, of course, if I ever need to go into my lead-in or lead-out parameters, it's going to basically be able to dial it in. If you remember on the last part, what I did here is I came in and I extended it to go past my geometry, and all I need to do is come into lead-in, lead-out, say extend, and I can either extend it or shorten it up to where I need to. Now in this case, if I extended it, let's say by 1/4 inch, we're going to know that's going to crash in my jaws. Maybe not. Okay, so that actually worked. And if I come in and back plot this, you can see right there it's only doing the cut, and of course there's not enough material for it to take, so it cuts off again, and then it does the final one. So again, it's basically taking that profile and offsetting it a couple times and basing the stock off of it as well. Now the other thing you could do too is come in here, and I could also do like groove or something. We'll say maybe I'll groove just this little channel. Go from there. We'll say that groover tool, use stock for a boundary. I can rough it out, and then of course I can change a couple miscellaneous settings, and we're good to go. So lastly, I'm just going to do a finish path on this one, and then of course I'm going to use what we call the stock flip. So if you don't have a sub-spindle on your machine and you don't want to split up your part into two separate files, we can go ahead and use the stock flip in here. So that is good to go as far as my first side here. Maybe I just need to take a pass on the back and clean that up. So what I'm going to do there is under Tool Paths, I can go down to my miscellaneous ops, and I'm going to go ahead and use the stock flip. So this one is just a software-based type of function, and I come in here, I'm going to select my geometry of that. With this one I can also offset that level and make sure it's good to go. My transfer position is going to be the length of my part, so it's going to be negative 4.5. My original position is standard, that's good to go. And then of course my final position is going to be these coordinates here, and that's basically going to be taking the jaw and placing it right there. Once I say OK, you can see I do have both sets of geometry. I can just come in here, turn off level 2, and all I'm left with is level 12. So there it is. There's my part with my jaws. And then of course lastly I'm just going to go ahead and do a tool path face with my tool facing down to Z0, and we're good to go. So that'll kind of cover all the newer style of tool paths that possibly people aren't familiar with. Also a little bit more functionality on how to transfer your parts and keep it kind of all in the same file. The only other thing kind of too would be if I go back to this first part here, I'm going to go ahead and dynamite everything, that way I don't need to worry about it. And actually I should have a step file I can open up. So let's say this is my part again, and let's say I just want to kind of do some basic operations without creating that term profile. So this is more or less along the lines of the solids chaining. So with this, if I want to, I can set up some stock, and we'll just set up some arbitrary numbers here. Cylinder, 2 inches, 10, that's fine. Again, jaws, always best to set those up. Let's say 4 inches. That way we can click and check against those if needed. And then of course, let's say I want to do a standard rough here. Well, I'm just going to go to Toolpath Rough. Okay, I don't have any wireframe on here, so I can't use my wireframe mode. I have to change it over to my solids tab. It's going to be the same in mill if you ever used your solid chaining in mill. You basically come in here and it's basically internally creating that term profile for you, except for it's not actually physically going to create it. So I'm going to tell it this is my first entity and my last entity and say OK. Then of course I can pick my tool, put in all my standard information, and then of course there's that lead in, lead out. I want to lead out and extend it by my distance. And again, you can see that lead out extending is extending it by 150 here, and maybe we're taking a 125 cutoff and cutting it off, so it creates a little pocket back there. So you can basically do all your tool paths that you would need to with your solid chaining.
Let's see if I'm going to switch back to the presenter, Ryan, and I'm going to try to see if this handout will work. All right, you guys should be able to hear me now. So they have a new function in here called handouts. Can you go to the audience view so I can see it this fast, right?
Yeah.
So this is basically a PDF that I worked with Mastercam with made up. Okay, you guys can see this because there's a couple differences on what we're going over today and a couple things I want to make you all aware of. If you currently have Lathe X9 added the ability to full 3D verification, which we didn't really get into that today because we did the Verify webinar last month. But the things I have highlighted in yellow here are not included in the entry product. And the way the pricing restructured when we did it last year, if you already have any other Mastercam product besides Lathe and you want to upgrade from entry to regular Lathe, it's only about a couple $100 now. And you might be thinking like, okay, I only have, you know, a 2-axis machine. How could that benefit me? Well, there's a couple things in here that entry doesn't have that the regular lathe would have that would even apply to a 2-axis machine. And one is the dynamic roughing is not included in the entry product. And we've seen a lot of customers get good results with that, especially if you have kind of round sort of dish-shaped areas where you have to get a lot of material out and you want to, you know, get rid of ring burrs and things like that. It's a really handy tool path for removing that stuff. And also in entry, the only what we call miscellaneous operation is the stock flip. So all the other functions in there like steady rest, tail stock, the chuck function, and a few others in there are not included in the entry product. So I just want to kind of go over that with you guys. The only other thing on here too is when you start combining lathe with mill is when you start getting the quote-unquote mill turn functionality. Because if I'm in lathe here, under my tool pass menu, with just standard lathe by itself without the mill product, your milling operations are limited to basically what's under the C-axis menu here. So if I were to try to do anything under the mill menu, it wouldn't allow me. So if I wanted to say on this part here, cut out this channel with like a dynamic peel mill operation, for example, that's when I would need the mill license to basically use those live tools a little more effectively. And that's just kind of my quick preview on that. But I will swing this back over to Ryan, and he'll go over the lathe tool library a little bit because we're getting right towards the end of our time limit here.
All right, awesome. Thank you, Matt. So kind of just some last things on as far as the tool manager goes. I'm just going to start a brand new file here. So under toolpaths, we do have the lathe tool manager. If you're familiar with more or less the mill tool manager, it's going to be along the same lines. Now this one is just going to be the embedded one. It's not going to be a standalone on the outside, kind of like we were talking in a previous webinar on. If you ever need to create a brand new tool library for the lathe, again, we can just go ahead and say create new tool library. I'm going to go ahead and say, you know, ShopWare tools. And of course, it's going to automatically put me in the default location. So with this is going to be my standard one here. This is going to be my new one. So I'm going to go ahead and use a couple different tools as far as the standard one gives me. So let's say I have a standard rough. Let's say I have a finish tool. And maybe let's say we have a groover. I can copy those 3 tools up on the top. I'm going to go ahead and open up my ShopWare tools. And what I can do is I can highlight those and drag them down at the bottom. And once I say OK, it's automatically going to be saving those tools in here for me to use at a later date. With that as well, if you ever need to, you can always right-click and say Edit Tools, and basically come in here and get all the information to your tools to set them up exactly perfect the first time around. With that, there's different things as far as your catalogs for your standard inserts. We have everything that you can fine-tune as far as our holders, and of course parameters if you have specific tool number locations that those are going to be in. If you want to try changing and defaulting some parameters here, and then of course under Setup Tool, is it going to be going in a clockwise or counterclockwise, and then of course main or sub, top or bottom turrets, all that good jazz. So there's a lot of good stuff that you can do in here to fine-tune it. That way when you pick on that tool, it's good to go the first time around. You don't have to mess around with a lot of your settings. So with that being said, I think that will conclude a lot of the topics that we have gone through. I'll check with Matt and see if he's got anything else for me.
I think that's it. Before we get into questions, I'm going to launch one more poll here. And it's basically topics for the next webinar. We are probably going to do the 2017 preview towards the end of next month, but this would probably be more for the June, July, August webinars. So if you have any topics you'd like to see. I just put a couple in there that we haven't covered so far this year. But if you have any other ones, you know, just put it in as a question or shoot us an email to either sales or tech@shopware.com.
Everybody see the questions. That's all.
They can't see these ones now.
People. 58.
Yeah, we ended up with 775. But okay, I'm going to close the poll out now. Like most of you have responded. Feedback. Like a lot of people want to see preview as well as SolidWorks and some Mill 3D. And it'll probably be a good idea to wait to do the Mill 3D until after 2017 releases. Because when we do the preview webinar, we're even doing some more fine-tuning a lot of those, the hybrid, the dynamic copy rough. Yeah, there's going to be some cool features that I think you're going to be able to take advantage of and make your life a little easier. But I haven't seen any questions rolling in, so if anyone has anything to ask, feel free. This is now the time. And I'll give it a couple of minutes here, otherwise we'll go ahead and end the webinar. But as always, we appreciate you guys taking the time out of your work day to attend this, and hopefully you got something out of it. If you missed it or you want to check it out again, it will be on our YouTube page after, but it does look like we have a couple of questions to mention. Let's answer Ryan. You try to go in order. Can you change your tool orientation for cutoff? I have a more with a V head. Oh, and John left. Oh, John now. But the orientation of the tool can be controlled via your tool settings. Anyone else is curious about that question. But you basically assign the name that it's coming from. You guys were getting into a lot of that. We have a lot of machines like that. The mill turn product has additional options on how to control that angle. And also do a lot more simulation. We have machines with V-heads and different things like that. Does the contour work on the ID?
Yep, so if you just looked at my screen here, I just did the, this is one of my training example files that I did have. So before, what I did is I just drilled out that stock to, let's say, a standard size of a drill. And then, of course, I just did the contour rough from here to here. And then, of course, as long as you have a boring bar inside of the tool being loaded up, it will be the same parameters and, of course, generate a tool path off of that. So there would be an example of the contour on an ID.
That looks like all the questions we have so far, and I don't see any more coming in, and people are all starting to bail. So I'm going to stop recording.